The millionaire stood frozen outside a crumbling window, watching a woman he had fired just hours ago carefully divide every piece of food she had stolen. His hands trembled against the rough wall as he witnessed something that shattered his entire understanding of right and wrong. The bread she had taken from his kitchen was now being placed onto a chipped plate. The bruised apples he had accused her of stealing were being cut into small pieces with a dull knife. The container of rice that had sealed her termination was being spooned into tiny portions with mathematical precision, and she was not eating any of it. 4 children with hollow cheeks and desperate eyes sat around her in that broken room, their small bodies leaning toward the food like flowers reaching for sunlight. They were starving. They were forgotten. And this woman he had called a thief was the only thing standing between them and complete destruction. Have you ever judged someone so quickly, so completely, that you missed the truth standing right in front of you? Have you ever been so certain of your own righteousness that you failed to see the quiet heroism hiding beneath what looked like betrayal? What Marcus Harrington discovered that evening did not just change one woman's life. It completely shattered everything he believed about justice, about wealth, about the very foundation of his existence. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you believe in second chances and the power of hidden truths, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and join our community. Now let me take you back to where it all began, to a morning that seemed ordinary but would become the turning point of 2 lives forever intertwined by fate. The sun rose golden and warm over the Harrington estate that Tuesday morning, spilling through floor-to-ceiling windows and casting long shadows across marble floors, polished to mirror perfection. The mansion sat perched upon rolling hills overlooking the distant shimmer of the coastline, a monument of glass and stone that seemed to whisper of power with every breath of wind that caressed its towering columns. 47 rooms spread across 3 floors, a staff of 19 maintaining every surface, every garden path, every crystal chandelier that hung like frozen waterfalls from vaulted ceilings. Inside those pristine walls, silence ruled with an iron grip. Servants moved through their morning duties like ghosts, their footsteps muffled against imported rugs, their voices kept to whispers that barely disturbed the air. This was not a home filled with laughter or warmth. This was a fortress, beautiful but cold, impressive but lonely. Marcus Harrington descended the curved staircase at precisely 6:45, as he did every morning. At 44 years old, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who had clawed his way from nothing to everything through sheer force of will. His dark hair was streaked with distinguished gray at the temples. His jawline remained sharp despite the years. His eyes, the color of storm clouds before rain, held an intensity that made subordinates look away and competitors reconsider their strategies. He had built his shipping empire from a single rusted vessel purchased with borrowed money and desperate hope. Now his company dominated 3 continents. His investments multiplied across industries like wildfire catching dry timber. His name appeared in magazines alongside words like visionary and ruthless, and he considered both terms compliments of the highest order. But success had demanded its price, though Marcus rarely paused long enough to calculate the cost. He entered the dining room where a single-place setting interrupted the vast mahogany table. 20 chairs surrounded him, all empty, all perfectly aligned. His breakfast waited in precise arrangement. Black coffee in a white porcelain cup, fresh fruit cut into identical cubes, toast with exactly the right amount of butter. He ate without tasting, his mind already cycling through the day's agenda of conference calls and contract negotiations. To Marcus, the world operated on simple principles that never failed. Rules must be followed without exception. Loyalty must be proven through action and not words. Anyone who broke trust must face immediate and uncompromising consequences. These pillars had supported his rise from poverty to prominence. They had protected him from those who would exploit kindness as weakness. They had become so fundamental to his existence that he could no longer imagine thinking any other way. What he could not see, what he refused to examine, was how these same principles had slowly built walls around his heart. Walls so high and so thick that compassion could no longer find its way through. Walls that separated him from the struggles of ordinary people living ordinary lives filled with extraordinary desperation. That particular Tuesday morning began like any other. Marcus had no way of knowing that within the hour, a single moment would begin the unraveling of everything he thought he understood about himself and the world he had constructed. The kitchen occupied the entire east wing of the ground floor, a marvel of stainless steel and white marble, equipped with professional appliances that most restaurants would envy. 3 staff members typically worked the morning shift, preparing meals that Marcus rarely finished. and maintaining cleanliness standards that bordered on surgical precision. Every surface gleamed. Every utensil hung in its designated place. Every ingredient resided in labeled containers arranged by frequency of use. Marcus rarely entered this domain. The kitchen belonged to the staff, and he preferred to maintain clear boundaries between his world and theirs. But that morning, something pulled him from his usual route to the study. Perhaps it was restlessness that he could not name. Perhaps it was the strange feeling that had settled beneath his ribs upon waking, an uneasiness without obvious cause. Whatever the reason, he found himself pushing through the swinging door into the kitchen's bright interior. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. In the corner near the service entrance stood a young woman in the simple gray uniform of a housemaid. Her dark hair was pinned beneath a white cap. Her slight frame seemed almost fragile against the industrial backdrop of commercial appliances. Her name was Isadora Vega, though Marcus barely knew this. She had worked at the estate for only 4 months, one of nearly 20 staff members whose faces blurred together in his perception of the household machinery. Her hands moved quickly, desperately, as she wrapped leftover bread from the previous night's dinner in a thin cloth. A handful of bruised apples, ones that would have been discarded within hours anyway, disappeared into the folds. A small container of rice, perhaps 2 cups at most, joined the modest collection. Her movements were furtive, rushed, marked by the unmistakable anxiety of someone who knew she was breaking rules. "What do you think you are doing?" Marcus's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. The words emerged cold, controlled, carrying the weight of absolute authority that came from years of commanding boardrooms and bending competitors to his will. Isadora spun around so quickly that her cap shifted on her head. The color drained from her face with such completeness that she appeared almost translucent, a ghost caught in the act of haunting. The bundle trembled visibly in her small hands. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged beyond the shallow, panicked rhythm of her breathing. "I asked you a question." Marcus stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them like a physical force. "You are stealing from my household. Sir, please." Her voice was barely a whisper, cracked at its edges like old paper. "If you would just let me explain." "Explain." Marcus laughed, but the sound held no trace of humor, only cold dismissal. "Explain theft. There is no explanation. There is only the act and its consequence." He raised his hand, palm outward, silencing whatever desperate plea had begun to form on her trembling lips. In his world, intentions meant nothing. Actions were everything. A theft was a theft, regardless of its scale. A broken rule was a broken rule, regardless of circumstance. These principles had carried him through decades of business dealings, had protected him from those who would manipulate his sympathy for their own advantage. "Collect your things." His voice fell flat and final, like a judge delivering a verdict that allowed no appeal. "You have 10 minutes to leave the property." The head of household staff appeared at the doorway, summoned by some invisible current of tension that rippled through the mansion's walls. Mrs. Patterson, a severe woman who had managed the estate for 12 years, took in the scene with a single glance. Marcus delivered his instructions without looking at Isadora again. No severance payment, no reference letter, no second chances. The message would be clear to every other employee who might consider similar betrayals. Within minutes, Isadora Vega stood at the massive iron gates of the Harrington estate, the small cloth bundle still clutched against her chest like a shield. She wore no coat because there had been no time to retrieve it from the staff quarters. Her thin uniform offered little protection against the morning breeze that swept down from the hills, carrying the scent of manicured gardens and chlorinated fountains in wealthy perfection. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and fell in disarray around her shoulders. Her cheeks were pale, but her eyes remained dry. She did not cry. She did not pound on the gates demanding to be heard. She did not call out injustice to the impassive security cameras mounted on the stone pillars. She simply stood there for a long moment, her gaze fixed upon some distant point beyond the pristine lawns and sparkling fountains and the world that had just expelled her. Then, slowly, she turned and began to walk down the long road that led away from the hills and toward whatever waited below. Marcus watched from his study window on the second floor, his arms crossed against his chest. He expected to feel satisfaction, the righteous clarity that always accompanied the enforcement of his principles. He expected the matter to settle in his mind as closed, completed, filed away among dozens of similar incidents across his career. Instead, he felt only a strange hollowness, a nagging discomfort that settled somewhere beneath his ribs and refused to dissolve no matter how firmly he tried to dismiss it. She did not argue. The thought formed unbidden in his mind. She did not defend herself. The observation bothered him more than he wanted to admit. The day proceeded with its usual demands, each hour filled with the responsibilities of an empire that required constant attention. Contracts awaited signatures in his study. Subordinates required direction through video conferences spanning 3 time zones. Markets required monitoring as numbers flickered across multiple screens like digital heartbeats measuring the health of his fortune. Yet through every meeting, every phone call, every strategic decision, Marcus found his thoughts drifting back to that moment in the kitchen. The image of Isadora's face haunted the edges of his concentration, appearing uninvited between sentences of financial reports and clauses of legal documents. It was not her fear that troubled him, though that had been evident enough. It was something else in her expression, something he could not quite name despite turning it over repeatedly in his mind. Resignation, perhaps that was the word, or acceptance, as if she had known from the very beginning that this outcome was inevitable, as if she had already calculated the cost of her actions and decided to pay the price without protest. By mid-afternoon, the discomfort had grown into something Marcus could no longer push aside. It gnawed at him with persistent teeth, demanding acknowledgement, demanding action. He tried to dismiss it as foolish sentiment, a momentary weakness unbecoming of a man in his position. He reminded himself of the principles that had built everything he possessed. But the feeling only intensified. What was in that bundle? The question surfaced again and again. Bread, apples, rice, items of negligible value. Items that would have been thrown away within days. Why would she risk her employment for such meager scraps? Why would she accept termination without even attempting to justify her actions? Finally, against every instinct that had guided his successful life, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. He would follow her. The justification he constructed was flimsy at best. He wanted to understand her audacity, he told himself. He wanted to confirm that she was nothing more than a common thief who had attempted to exploit his generosity. He wanted evidence that would silence the strange voice whispering doubt in the back of his mind. But deeper down, in chambers of his heart he had long neglected, something else stirred. Something that demanded answers to questions he could not quite articulate. Something that sensed a truth hidden beneath the surface of what he thought he knew. Now, what Marcus was about to discover would change everything. But before we continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where your gut told you that you had made a terrible mistake? Have you ever felt certainty crumbling beneath your feet as new information forced you to see differently? Drop a comment below and tell me about it. And if you are new here, make sure to subscribe because this story is about to take a turn you will not see coming. Marcus left the estate through a side entrance, avoiding the curious eyes of staff members who would wonder why the master of the house was departing without his driver. His personal vehicle, a sleek black automobile worth more than most families earned in a decade, seemed suddenly conspicuous. But he drove it anyway, following the route he had watched Isadora take from his study window. The landscape changed gradually at first, then dramatically. Manicured lawns gave way to overgrown lots where wildflowers pushed through cracked concrete. Boutique shops with elegant window displays transformed into cramped convenience stores, with bars across their windows and faded signs advertising prices from years past. The smooth pavement that curved through wealthy neighborhoods surrendered to cracked asphalt patched with tar that had melted and hardened countless times. Marcus had lived in this city for over 2 decades. He had attended galas in its finest ballrooms, conducted business in its tallest towers, dined in restaurants where a single meal cost more than some families spent on food in a month. Yet he had never ventured into these neighborhoods. They existed in his awareness only as abstractions, statistics and economic reports he skimmed without emotional engagement, occasional subjects of charity events he attended more for networking than philanthropy. The reality of these streets was entirely different from the numbers on paper. Narrow alleys branched between buildings that leaned against each other like exhausted travelers. Laundry hung from lines strung between windows, faded fabrics flapping in the afternoon breeze. Children played in the dust with toys made from discarded materials, their laughter somehow bright despite the gray surroundings. Elderly men sat on crumbling stoops, their eyes tracking Marcus's expensive car with expressions that mingled curiosity and suspicion. The smell reached him even through closed windows. Cooking oil and garbage and humanity pressed together in spaces never designed for so many bodies. The sounds filtered through, Horns and voices, and somewhere in the distance, music playing from a radio with a broken speaker. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Not quite guilt, not yet, but an awareness, perhaps for the first time, that his carefully constructed world represented only the smallest fraction of how most people actually lived. He spotted Isadora walking along a narrow street, her thin figure weaving between puddles that had formed from sources he preferred not to identify. She moved with purpose despite her obvious exhaustion, her steps quickening as she approached what appeared to be her destination. The cloth bundle remained pressed against her chest, protected as though it contained something precious beyond its simple contents. Marcus parked at a distance, his expensive car drawing glances from the few residents who lingered in doorways and on corners. He felt their eyes upon him as he stepped out onto the cracked pavement, felt their assessment of his tailored clothes and polished shoes. He did not belong here. Everything about him screamed of a world separated from theirs by more than just geography. But curiosity had consumed him entirely now, burning past discomfort, past self-consciousness, past every instinct telling him to return to the safety of his hills and his mansion and his principles. He followed on foot, keeping enough distance to remain unnoticed, his shadow stretching long in the late afternoon light. Isadora turned down an alley so narrow that the buildings on either side nearly touched above their heads. She walked past doorways covered with plastic sheets, past windows stuffed with newspaper for insulation, past walls decorated with graffiti that ranged from artistic to desperate. Then she stopped. The structure before her barely deserved the word house. Its walls had been constructed from mismatched materials gathered over time, corrugated metal sheets scarred with rust, weathered plywood that had begun to warp and split, sections of plastic sheeting that fluttered in the breeze like ragged flags of surrender. The door hung crooked on a single hinge, its wood swollen from moisture and cracked from sun. The only window had been covered with cardboard that had grown soft and dark from repeated exposure to rain and humidity. Isadora knocked 3 times in quick succession. A signal, Marcus realized, a code that announced her identity to whoever waited within. The door creaked open on its damaged hinge. What Marcus saw through that doorway made the blood drain from his face and the strength flee from his legs. 4 children stared back at Isadora with eyes that seemed far too large for their gaunt faces. Their cheeks were hollow, shadowed by hunger that had become a permanent resident rather than a passing visitor. Their clothes hung loose on thin frames, garments clearly meant for larger bodies, worn soft and faded from countless washings. The youngest could not have been more than 3 years old, her tiny frame propped against an older boy who appeared to be fighting a fever that painted his cheeks with unnatural color. 2 others, girls who looked perhaps 6 and 8, clutched each other with the desperate affection of creatures who had learned early that the world offered few comforts and no guarantees. None of them were Isadora's children. That much was immediately clear from the mixture of features, the varying ages, the way they looked at her not as sons and daughters but as something else entirely. Something reverent, something grateful, something that transcended blood relation and touched upon a bond forged through shared survival. Dora is back. The youngest whispered these words with a joy so pure that it traveled across the threshold and struck Marcus like a physical blow to his chest. Her tiny voice carried all the hope that remained in that crumbling shelter, all the faith that tomorrow might be better than today. Isadora knelt before the children, her exhaustion transforming into tenderness as she produced the cloth bundle from beneath her arm. The door closed behind her, but Marcus had positioned himself near the cardboard-covered window. A gap between the cardboard and the frame allowed him to see inside, to witness what happened next with terrible clarity. She unwrapped the stolen goods with reverent care. The bread was placed onto a chipped ceramic plate that had long ago lost its matching set. The bruised apples were cut into small pieces with a knife so dull that it required sawing motions to break the skin. The rice was spooned into a small pot that sat over a makeshift stove constructed from scavenged materials. The children gathered around the modest meal like pilgrims approaching a sacred shrine. But they did not grab or fight over portions. They waited with patience that should have been impossible for children so young and so hungry. They watched as Isadora divided everything with mathematical precision, ensuring that each child received exactly the same amount. And then Marcus noticed the detail that shattered something fundamental within him. Isadora did not eat. She sat with the children as they consumed their small portions. She smiled at their whispered conversations about dreams and games and the stories she had told them the night before. She brushed hair from the feverish boy's forehead with gentle fingers. She adjusted the youngest girl's oversized shirt where it had slipped from her bony shoulder. But she did not take a single bite for herself. The food she had taken from his kitchen, the theft for which she had been fired without mercy, had never been intended for her own stomach. Every crumb, every morsel, every bruised piece of fruit had been destined for these abandoned children living in a shelter that offered no true shelter at all. Marcus's legs weakened beneath him. He pressed his palm against the rough exterior wall, desperate for something solid to counter the dissolution happening inside his chest. His vision blurred as tears gathered at the corners of his eyes, tears he could not remember shedding in years, decades, perhaps ever. The word echoed through his mind with the force of a gavel falling. Shame. He thought of his mansion with its 47 rooms. He thought of his dining table set for one, surrounded by 19 empty chairs. He thought of the food discarded from his kitchen every single day, enough to feed a dozen families, thrown away because it was no longer fresh enough for his refined palate. He thought of the judgment he had delivered that morning with such cold certainty, the righteousness that had felt so pure when he stood in his gleaming kitchen and pronounced sentence upon a woman whose crime was keeping children alive. In that crumbling doorway stood the truth, naked and undeniable. This woman he had called a thief was not stealing for greed or selfishness. She was stealing to keep 4 abandoned children from starving. She was sacrificing her only source of income, her only chance at stability, to provide one more meal for little ones who had no one else in the world. And he, with all his wealth and all his principles and all his righteous certainty, had nearly destroyed her for it. Marcus remained in the shadows as evening descended upon the neighborhood, transforming the narrow alleys into corridors of purple shadow and distant lamplight. He watched through the gap in the cardboard as Isadora tended to her small family, unable to leave, unable to look away, bearing witness to a sacrifice that put his entire existence to shame. The feverish boy received her attention first. She pressed her palm against his forehead, reading his temperature with the expertise of someone who had done this many times before. From a small box in the corner, she retrieved dried herbs that she crumbled into a cracked cup, then added water that she heated over the makeshift stove. The tea she brewed was medicine, Marcus realized. Homemade remedies passed down through generations of people who could not afford doctors or pharmacies. She held the cup to the boy's lips, helping him drink in small sips, murmuring words too soft for Marcus to hear but whose meaning was clear in their tone. Comfort, encouragement, love. The 2 girls sat close together on a thin mattress that had been placed directly on the dirt floor. Their eyes followed Isadora's movements with quiet attention, and when she finished with the tea, she settled beside them. She began to tell a story, her voice rising and falling with an animation that seemed impossible given her circumstances. The girls leaned against her, their earlier tension dissolving as they lost themselves in the tale. Marcus could not hear the words, but he could see the magic happening. For a few minutes, the crumbling walls ceased to exist. The hunger in their bellies faded to background noise. The uncertainty of tomorrow became irrelevant in the face of this moment, this connection, this love that asked nothing in return. The youngest child had already begun to drift toward sleep, her tiny body curled on a mattress no thicker than a folded blanket. Isadora finished her story and crossed the small room with silent steps. She lifted the little girl with tender care and carried her to the sleeping area, adjusting the thin covering, smoothing hair from her peaceful face. Then she sang. The melody was soft, barely louder than breathing, but it carried to where Marcus stood frozen in the darkness. A lullaby in a language he did not recognize, passed down through generations he could not imagine, sung by a young woman who had nothing yet gave everything she possessed. One by one, the children surrendered to sleep. The feverish boy's breathing deepened as the tea and the lullaby worked their combined magic. The 2 girls nestled against each other, their fingers intertwined even in dreams. The youngest had already entered whatever worlds lived behind her closed eyes. Isadora sat alone in the dim room, lit only by a single candle that flickered against the cardboard window. Her shoulders, which had remained strong throughout the evening, finally bowed under the weight she carried. She did not cry. She did not rage against the injustice that had stripped away her employment, her income, her ability to provide for these children who depended on her utterly. She simply sat in the silence, her head lowered, her hands folded in her lap, gathering strength for whatever tomorrow would demand. In that moment, watching her solitary figure in the candlelight, Marcus understood something that no business school had ever taught him, that no financial success had ever revealed. This woman possessed a wealth he could not begin to comprehend. She had found these children 18 months ago, he would later learn, living in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, eating whatever they could scavenge from garbage bins in the kindness of strangers. Their parents had been lost to various cruelties, death and imprisonment and disappearance, and the thousand ways that poverty devours families and scatters their remnants. The system had found them briefly, had attempted to process them through proper channels. But proper channels meant separation. The older ones to one facility, the younger to another, siblings in nothing but survival torn apart by bureaucratic necessity. Isadora had been working at a shelter when they arrived, had seen the terror in their eyes when social workers discussed the arrangements. She had made her choice in that moment, not a calculated decision weighed against consequences, but an act of pure instinct, of recognition that some bonds are too sacred to break regardless of cost. She had taken them, all four of them, found this crumbling structure and transformed it into something resembling home, worked whatever job she could find, never keeping a position long because employers eventually discovered the children, or the children fell ill and required her presence, or the desperate math of survival simply did not add up no matter how many hours she worked. The job at Marcus's estate had been her best opportunity in months. The salary was higher than anything she had earned before. The leftover food, discarded without thought by a kitchen that prepared meals for one man who rarely finished them, had kept her small family fed when her wages could not stretch far enough. She had known the risk every time she wrapped those scraps in cloth and slipped them into her bag. She had known that discovery meant dismissal, meant starting over, meant the increasingly impossible task of finding another position that would allow her to keep the children together. But what choice did she have? Watch them starve while surrounded by abundance. Explain to hollow-eyed little ones that principles and property rights mattered more than their hunger. No, there had never been a choice at all. The sun had fully set when Marcus finally stepped out of the shadows. His legs felt unsteady beneath him. His heart raced with an unfamiliar rhythm. For the first time in decades, the powerful millionaire was afraid, not of loss or failure or the competitive threats that usually occupied his concerns, but of facing the truth of who he had become. He crossed the narrow space between his hiding place and the crooked door. He raised his hand. He knocked. 3 times. Quick succession. The signal he had observed earlier. Silence inside, then movement. The scrape of something being moved aside, a precaution against unwanted visitors. The creak of the damaged hinge as the door opened just enough to see who stood outside. Isadora's face appeared in the gap. Her eyes, already weary from the day's events, widened with shock at the sight of Marcus Harrington standing in the doorway of her crumbling sanctuary. The color drained from her cheeks. Her body shifted instinctively to block the view of the children sleeping behind her. Fear rose in her expression, immediate and understandable. She expected more punishment. A demand for return of the stolen goods perhaps, or notification that authorities had been called to address her crime. Her chin lifted slightly despite the fear, a gesture of dignity that seemed impossible given her circumstances, but that she refused to abandon. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but the words that had come so easily that morning, the cold pronouncements of rules and consequences, would not form. He stood there in silence, this powerful man who commanded empires, unable to produce a single sentence. "I followed you." The words finally emerged, rough and unfamiliar in his own ears. His voice cracked on the second word, betraying emotion he could not control. "I saw everything. The children, the food, what it was really for." Isadora studied him for a long moment, searching his face for deception and finding something she clearly had not expected. His eyes were red-rimmed. His composure, which had seemed unshakable that morning, had fractured into something raw and human. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man capable of feeling. She stepped back slightly, allowing the door to open wider. Behind her, the children continued sleeping, unaware of the confrontation happening at their threshold. They had nowhere else to go. Her voice carried no pleading, no self-pity, only facts delivered with the quiet strength of someone who had made peace with her choices. Their parents are gone, dead, imprisoned, disappeared. The system was going to separate them, send them to different facilities across the city. They are siblings, not by blood, but by everything that matters. I could not let that happen. "How long?" Marcus asked. 18 months. Since I found them living in an abandoned warehouse, eating from garbage bins. She paused, her jaw tightening. "I took the job at your estate because it paid better than anything else I could find, and because your kitchen wasted enough food to keep them alive." The sentence struck Marcus like a physical blow to his chest. Your kitchen wasted enough food to keep them alive. He thought of every plate returned untouched to his professional kitchen, Every elaborate meal prepared for guests who never arrived because he had forgotten to maintain the friendships that might have filled his empty chairs. Every morning when perfectly good bread was discarded, simply because it had passed some arbitrary threshold of freshness that only he would ever notice. Lives hanging on his leftovers. Children surviving on what his household threw away without a second thought. I was wrong. The words emerged with difficulty, fighting against decades of habit, against an identity built on never admitting error. But they emerged nonetheless, and once spoken, they opened a floodgate Marcus had not known existed. I was so focused on rules that I forgot about reasons, so concerned with theft that I ignored necessity, so determined to protect my property that I failed to see actual human beings standing in front of me. Isadora's expression shifted, the defensive tension in her shoulders easing slightly, but her eyes remained guarded, waiting. Your apology does not feed them. Her voice was steady, neither accusatory nor pleading. It does not give me back my job or help me find a new one before the landlord comes for the rent I cannot pay. Words are easy, Mr. Harrington. I have heard many words from many people who promised help and delivered nothing. No. Marcus shook his head slowly. An apology is just words. You are right. But actions, I can offer actions. What happens next will show you the true measure of a man. It is not about how much money he has. It is about what he does when he finally sees clearly. If you are still with me, drop the word redemption in the comments. And make sure you have subscribed, because we are not done yet. That night became the first of many that would reshape two lives entirely. Marcus did not simply apologize and leave. He did not offer vague promises to be fulfilled at some convenient future date. Instead, he pulled out his phone and began making calls. His voice carried the same authority he used in boardroom negotiations, but directed now toward entirely different ends. Within an hour, proper food arrived at the crumbling shelter. Not scraps or leftovers, but fresh groceries carried by a confused delivery driver who had never been asked to bring provisions to this part of the city. Milk and eggs and bread still warm from the bakery. Vegetables and fruits and protein that the children had not tasted in months. A doctor arrived shortly after, a private physician who normally treated only the wealthy, but who owed Marcus favors accumulated over years of business dealings. The feverish boy was examined with gentle thoroughness, his condition diagnosed, proper medication prescribed. The other children received checkups as well, their malnourishment noted, and dietary recommendations provided. Blankets appeared, thick and warm and free of the holes that marked the thin coverings currently in use. Clothes arrived, not perfectly sized but far better than the oversized garments the children had been wearing. A portable heater was installed to combat the cold that would intensify as autumn deepened toward winter. Isadora watched these developments with an expression that shifted between suspicion and disbelief. She had learned through harsh experience to distrust generosity, to expect strings attached to every gift, conditions that would ultimately prove impossible to meet. Yet Marcus asked nothing of her except to accept what he offered. This is not charity. He said these words as the last of the supplies were unloaded. This is debt repayment. I owe you far more than I can ever calculate. The children woke to a world transformed. The youngest squealed with delight at the sight of fresh fruit, holding an orange as though it were a precious jewel. The feverish boy, already responding to proper medication, managed a smile that had been absent for weeks. The two girls explored the new blankets with wonder, their fingers tracing patterns on fabrics softer than anything they had touched in months. And Isadora, for the first time since Marcus had known her, allowed tears to fall. The morning after brought Marcus back to the shelter, this time without the pretense of surveillance. He came openly, knocking on the crooked door and waiting for permission to enter. He carried coffee and pastries from a bakery he had never noticed despite driving past it countless times. The children regarded him with curiosity rather than fear. The youngest, emboldened by the wonders of the previous night, approached him with the orange he had provided, holding it up for his inspection as though seeking approval for her treasure. Something cracked open in Marcus's chest at that moment, something that had been sealed since childhood, since the years of struggle before success, since the conscious decision to harden himself against a world that seemed designed to exploit softness. He knelt to her level and admired the orange with exaggerated seriousness. Then he showed her how to peel it, something she had apparently never learned, and the delight on her face when she tasted the fresh fruit was worth more than any contract he had ever signed. The days that followed established a new pattern. Marcus did not simply throw money at the problem and retreat to his comfortable distance. He became personally involved in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. He found Isadora not merely a job, but a position, a role within a new foundation he established specifically to address the needs he had been blind to for so long. Her title was Director of Community Outreach, but her real function was to do exactly what she had been doing all along, to identify families in crisis, to provide assistance without bureaucratic obstacles, to treat human beings as human beings rather than cases to be processed. The salary was 3 times what she had earned at his estate. The hours were flexible enough to allow her to care for the children who were now officially in her custody, thanks to lawyers Marcus retained to navigate the foster system's complexities. No more hiding, no more fear that discovery would tear her family apart. The children received what they needed most: stability. The feverish boy was enrolled in a treatment program that addressed his chronic condition with proper medical care. Tutors were hired to help all 4 catch up on the education their circumstances had denied them. A real home was found, a small house with solid walls and windows that actually kept out the weather, close enough to Isadora's new office that she could be present without sacrificing her responsibilities. But Marcus's transformation did not stop with one family. He began visiting the neighborhoods he had previously ignored, walking streets where his expensive shoes quickly became scuffed and dirty. He talked to people, not as potential employees or business contacts, but as fellow human beings with stories worth hearing. He learned about the grandmother raising 6 grandchildren after her daughter's death, the veteran sleeping in doorways, because the system designed to help him had failed at every turn, the teenagers working night shifts to keep younger siblings fed while maintaining perfect grades in hopes of scholarship salvation. The scope of invisible suffering overwhelmed him. How had he lived so close to such need without ever acknowledging its existence? How had he convinced himself that poverty was merely a lack of effort, that struggling families simply needed to work harder, that his success proved the system functioned fairly for everyone willing to put in the time? The foundation he created bore Isadora's name, despite her protests. Its operations differed fundamentally from the charitable organizations Marcus had previously supported. The galas where wealthy people congratulated each other's generosity while spending more on catering than they donated to causes. This foundation hired from the communities it served. It trusted people who had experienced poverty to understand what their neighbors actually needed. It provided direct assistance without mountains of paperwork, designed to protect donors from the imaginary legions of fraudulent poor. It measured success not in publicity generated, but in lives actually improved. Isadora led this effort with the same fierce dedication she had shown those 4 children. Her experience on both sides of the economic divide gave her insight that no business degree could provide. She knew which programs actually helped and which ones existed primarily to make donors feel virtuous. She recognized the difference between charity that empowered and charity that created dependence. Within a year, the foundation had touched hundreds of families across the city. Food banks operated with dignity rather than judgment. Job training programs led to actual employment rather than certificates nobody accepted. Medical clinics provided care to those who had previously relied on emergency rooms for conditions that could have been prevented with basic attention. The 4 children Isadora had rescued grew up knowing security they had never imagined possible. The boy whose fever had worried Marcus that first night recovered fully and developed a passion for medicine, eventually pursuing the education that would allow him to help others as he had been helped. The 2 girls, close as twins despite their biological difference, became advocates themselves, returning to the neighborhoods of their childhood to mentor young people facing the same obstacles they had overcome. The youngest, the little one who had shown Marcus her orange with such innocent trust, grew into a young woman who specialized in educational policy, working to ensure that children like her former self would have opportunities she had nearly been denied. They remained siblings not by blood but by everything that mattered. Family dinners became a tradition, monthly gatherings where Isadora would cook meals in her modest kitchen while her 4 grown children filled the space with laughter and debate and the easy affection of people who had survived the worst together. Marcus was often invited to these dinners. The man who had once eaten alone at a table surrounded by empty chairs now found himself surrounded by warmth he had never known how to create within his own walls. He was not quite family, but something close to it. The improbable uncle who had stumbled into their story at exactly the right moment. His empire continued to thrive. Money still multiplied across accounts and investments. His name still appeared in business publications as an example of entrepreneurial success. But these achievements had shifted in his internal hierarchy. They were tools now rather than purposes, means rather than ends. The mansion on the hill remained his residence, but it had changed. Staff members were treated as people rather than machinery. Conversations happened in kitchens and hallways. The table set for one now regularly hosted gatherings of people who had never expected to dine in such luxury, but who were welcomed without judgment. Marcus learned that his principles had not been wrong, only incomplete. Rules still mattered in a functioning society. Standards still held value in any organized endeavor. But they required a foundation he had neglected for so long that he had forgotten its necessity: compassion, understanding, the recognition that behind every action, no matter how apparently inexcusable, there existed human beings with stories worth hearing. The cloth bundle that Isadora had carried from his kitchen that fateful morning now rested in a glass case in the Foundation's headquarters, a humble display that confused visitors who expected inspirational artifacts to be more impressive. The original cloth, stained and thin, a photograph of bruised apples and leftover bread, a small card explaining what these objects represented. The story was told again and again to donors and volunteers and curious observers who wanted to understand how this foundation had come to exist, how the most unlikely origin, a perceived theft, a wrongful termination, had sparked something that grew to help thousands. Each telling inspired others. Business owners who had never questioned their own assumptions began looking differently at employees they had dismissed. Wealthy donors who had written checks to prestigious institutions started directing their giving toward organizations that actually reached people in need. Ordinary citizens who had passed by poverty without seeing it started truly noticing the struggles that had been invisible in plain sight. If this story moves something within you, I need you to do something for me. First, hit that like button because it helps more people discover stories that matter. Second, share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Third, drop a comment telling me what moment hit you the hardest. And finally, if you have not already, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Every week I bring you stories that do not just entertain but transform. Because in a world that often feels cold, stories like this remind us that warmth still exists, that redemption is possible, that one moment of seeing clearly can change everything. Years later, when people asked Marcus about the turning point in his life, he would describe a morning in his kitchen. A young woman with trembling hands, a bundle of bread, rice, and bruised apples. I had everything. He would say these words with a humility that surprised those who had known him only as the ruthless businessman of his earlier years. Yet I understood nothing. I built an empire on ambition and lost myself somewhere inside it. It took a woman with almost nothing to show me what truly matters. He would pause then, his eyes growing distant with memory. She was saving lives with my leftovers. And I called her a thief. The lesson had cost him nothing but his pride. Yet it had given him something he had not known he was missing. A purpose that transcended profit margins and market dominance. A reason to wake each morning that had nothing to do with accumulation and everything to do with contribution. Because sometimes the greatest revelations arrive in the smallest packages. Sometimes our deepest truths hide in the actions of those we least expect. And sometimes, if we are fortunate enough to look beyond our assumptions, we discover that what we mistook for betrayal was actually the purest form of love, a stolen meal, a desperate act, a secret worth more than all the gold in any mansion. These were the unlikely foundations upon which new lives were built, lives defined not by wealth or poverty but by the courage to see one another clearly, to recognize that mercy requires more strength than judgment, that forgiveness opens doors that condemnation forever seals. The next time you are tempted to judge quickly, remember Isadora. Remember the children gathering around a chipped plate as though it held the greatest treasure in the world. Remember a man who thought he knew everything discovering that he had understood nothing at all. Because behind every face you encounter lies a story you cannot see. Behind every action that seems inexcusable may hide desperation you have never known. Behind every person you dismiss may be a hero quietly sacrificing everything for those who have no one else. Extend grace before judgment. Offer understanding before condemnation. And never underestimate the profound impact of simply choosing to look more closely at the world around you. Until next time, this is Mr. Andy Love Stories, reminding you that every person has a story worth hearing if we are brave enough to listen.